Okay, you're on air.
We'll just wait for a couple more people to get on and then get her started.
It's my voice on a lot of answering machines.
All right, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good evening. My name is Lindsay Smithson Stanley. I'm Deputy Director for Climate and Strategic Initiatives here at the National Audubon Society. I want to welcome you to tonight's telephone town hall with National Audubon Society President and Chief Executive David Yarnold and Chief Scientist Gary Langham. We'll be discussing how global warming will affect our birds right here in North America and what you can do to help. We'll begin in just a moment, and we're excited for everyone who's joined us. Before we begin, just a few points. Right now, we're in the process of dialing out to thousands of members, so please just stay on the line, and we'll be starting with David and Gary shortly. Just a reminder that if you would like to ask a question of Gary or David at any time during tonight's event, please just press 0 on your telephone keypad, and you'll be connected directly with one of our volunteer operators. Again, if at any time, and you can even have more than one, you can press 0 to ask a question. So we also have some questions that have been submitted via email, so I might get us started with some of those. For those of you who are just joining, thank you so much for giving us part of your evening tonight. Tonight's event is a telephone town hall with National Audubon Society President and CEO David Yarnold and Chief Scientist Gary Langham. They'll be discussing and taking questions about how global warming will affect birds all across the country. So I'll be the moderator. Right now we're calling out to thousands of people we've invited. We've also taken questions in addition to taking them live on the air tonight. We've taken some in advance via email, so we'll be alternating between those. And if you want to ask David or Gary a question at any time during the call, please press 0. Again, that's 0 at any time to ask a question. And I think we'll just sit tight and see how many folks we have connected. Again, this is tonight's telephone town hall with the National Audubon Society. Thanks y'all very, very much. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce CEO and National Audubon Society President, David Yarnold.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Fabulous. And then we also have with us Chief Scientist Gary Langham. Gary, why don't you go ahead and say hello so we all know you're there?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much. So while everyone thinks about their questions and we get them settled in the queue, I'd just kind of like to ask, we said that tonight's talk was going to be about global warming and birds. And Gary, I know you've been researching this for quite some time. So will you just summarize for the audience what you found?
Sure. The whole team of Audubon scientists found that nearly half of the birds in the United States and Canada are seriously threatened by climate change in this century. So 314 of the 588 species we were able to model, this range from familiar backyard birds like purple finches to iconic birds like brown pelicans, that there 314 of these are projected to lose more than half of their current climate range by 2080.
That's startling and really kind of scary. So is there hope, or does this mean for those 314 that they'll be lost?
No, I think there is a lot of hope, and really that's because we can still act to prevent the worst impacts of climate change this century. And some of the good news here is that we know that birds and nature respond very well to conservation efforts. The whole history of the conservation movement tells us that we can take action and birds and nature can respond. And the other good news is the climate report will help us spread the word about the magnitude of the problem. What are we facing, so that we can talk to our friends and neighbors. And it also gives us a roadmap to which species to focus on and where we can protect places these birds will depend on right now and into the future. So there's still a lot of hope and a lot we can do.
Good. That's good to hear and good to know. So before we get into some of those specific birds and what you'd like us to do, David, what is National Audubon Society going to do about this threat? David Yarnold, are you still on the line? Okay, well, it looks like we might not have him, but I know that that's something that a lot of folks are going to ask. So I just want to make sure before we start talking about the questions that if you want to know more about the report that Gary referenced, that you can find more at audubon.org/climate. We also have some fabulous functions where you can explore the threatened birds, which among those 314 are in your state, and then importantly, what you can do to help. So as I mentioned before, in addition to taking your questions live tonight, we requested folks to send some via email. So I want to start. Gary, we have someone, and I want to thank her, Amelia Walker, and she asks, my daughter is 8 years old. What about kids? What can kids do to help these 314 birds in danger right now?
Yeah, great question. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I think there's a lot that kids can do. Not only in their own homes by working with their parents to plant, native plants that are good for birds, but it's really important for kids to watch nature, learn more about birds. This could take the form of school projects, and really, I would also encourage Amelia to not be shy about asking adults, her teachers, and people in her neighborhood, what they're doing to help protect birds so that all kids can see them in the future.
That's excellent. Well, I hope anyone who has children, grandchildren, neighbors is willing to start having that conversation. So I want to go back to the science a little bit, Gary. We received a question from Robin Glennie from Vernon Rockville, Connecticut. So Robin asked, did you find a threat of habitat destruction from climate change for specialist bird species? Or will many alter their range, i.e. move farther north in the summer? And what habitats would you say are the most vulnerable to instability from climate change? So maybe this is a good moment, Gary, if you could tell us exactly what the study did and didn't look at and how it might inform what we know about habitats moving forward.
Yeah, great question, Robin. So the study we're talking about now didn't specifically look at habitat. We looked at 588 bird species. But you're absolutely right that birds that are specialists are even more vulnerable than others, and that's because a bird that's a habitat specialist is really tightly connected, not only climatically but also in what it does to make a living, making nests and getting food and whatnot to be successful to that very specific thing. And so it's not hard to imagine that even subtle shifts in the building blocks of climate are going to impact those habitat specialists even more. And we also know from the broader scientific literature that habitats are going to be under stress. And this makes sense when you think about it, that climate not only dictates at the broadest sense where birds can live and thrive, but also all the plants that they depend on as well. So we expect all these things to move, and perhaps what's most troubling is they don't necessarily move in conjunction with each other. For example, birds can fly, but trees can't. So birds are going to move a lot faster than plants will. And then that's going to create these mismatches where what's going to happen when the grassland specialist, arrives finding its climate space in the boreal forest? How is it going to make a living? Is it going to know how to find food or to make a nest? All these things are troubling and sort of underscore the broader disruption that we're projecting.
Thanks, Gary. So continuing on that idea of habitat loss and global warming and these kind of two different threats, I'm going to try to take a question now. I see that we have Paul from Sterling Heights. Paul, hang on just one moment, and we're trying to unmute you. Okay, Paul, I believe you're live. If you could go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. Just with all the, since the European settlers came and there was such a change in the landscape, do you think we can overcome really the change that's happened in the last 200 years? Don't you think we can overcome that with some simple steps that you might describe here?
Sure. Do you want me to take that, Lindsay?
I think you should, Gary. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's a great point that, in the last 150, 200 years that humans have dramatically transformed the habitats on the planet, both to develop our cities, but also to create our systems for agriculture and other things. And some of our habitats, like riparian systems, the trees and other plants along waterways, have been reduced as much as 99% in some places, wetlands more than 50%. So the habitat loss has really been the story of the last century, and the impacts in reducing birds and other plant and animal communities significantly. And then when you think about climate change coming in this next century and disrupting all that further, it can't rescue any of those losses, but it can exacerbate them. This is one of the fundamental troubling things about climate change, is that it presents itself in a way that makes all the traditional conservation things we've been focused on and learned a lot about, and makes that work even harder. And for that reason, I think it's even more vital that we have a framework and information like the Audubon Climate Report to help us make smart investments in where doing habitat restoration is most likely to pay off, both today and in the future. But the combination, the sort of the double punch of habitat loss and climate change are really what a lot of conservation in the next century are going to be all about.
Thanks, Gary.
This is David.
Thanks, David.
And, hi, Lindsay. I would just add one thing, and that is that, we can't turn back the clock, but we can certainly use the Audubon Report and its science to help make better decisions in the future. And the fact is that in order to make those decisions, everybody on this call, all 4 million of the people that Audubon talks to, it's nearly 800,000 members, and 57 million birders can all help make a better future for birds.
Great. So I want to go ahead and take our next question. Deb in Nebraska asks, and I think this is, actually, wait, no, there she is. We're going to unmute you, Deb. I'm sorry. There we go. So, Deb, you have a question that I believe is perfect for Gary. Will you go ahead, Deb?
Sure. I was just wondering how we can get other countries on board to help protect the migrating birds.
Yeah, so how we can protect migrating birds. We have more than 120 birds that spend their winter time in Central or South America. So it's a really good question, and it's perhaps troubling that for some of those birds we just don't have any idea how climate's going to impact them on their wintering ground, even as we start to get a better picture for how they're going to do in the summer months. I think that it's a great question. It speaks to the power of international partnerships. So Audubon is part of BirdLife International, and so there's a whole consortium of nonprofit organizations that work together to protect birds. And we're, I guess the most important message is we all can take action both in our individual lives wherever we live right now to reduce the threat of climate change and to take positive actions in our communities. We can work together at the state and federal level to work on policies that will do the right thing for birds and people. And that extends to the international community as well. So working with partners for protecting the climate strongholds and the important bird areas across the Western Hemisphere, but also reducing the ultimate cause here, which is greenhouse gases. And David, you might have some other thoughts here too.
Yeah, so one of the most important components of Gary's work is the fact that we have decades of Christmas bird count data and great backyard bird count data. And you can watch for some really interesting and exciting news about countries in Latin America beginning to participate in the Christmas bird count, and that'll be coming out fairly soon. In order to really understand what's happening during our winter months, it's really important to be able to do that bird census in the Southern Hemisphere. And there's some pretty exciting news coming out about that in the near future.
So let's switch tacks just a little bit, because I know we've gone big picture to international. Ann Annadale from Virginia has a question that I think a lot of us want to know. So Ann, go ahead, hon, and ask your question. You should be unmuted.
Okay, thank you. My question is, global warming has changed planting times and the types of plants that you can plant. How do I know what to plant that's good for birds, good for the insects that they need, and the good insects for your garden that are going to last for several years? Since a couple of years ago, where I live was in Zone 6, it's now Zone 7, which means we are getting warmer, and things are about a month off.
Gary, I know we want people to be able to take action in their backyards, but in this context, what would you say to Ann?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question, and they have the USDA has updated their hardiness zone maps 3 times since 1996, I believe. So things are, the plants know that things are changing already. I would say reaching out to your local nursery, or Garden Club of America, or Native Plant Society is a good start. But also reaching out to your local Audubon chapter or center is always a great way to get locally relevant information. And finally, I'll add that Audubon has a citizen science project called Hummingbirds at Home that's free to participate in, and also has a phone app where you can show your sightings of what hummingbirds are feeding on. And over the coming years, and we're going to be rolling out location-specific plants that are going to be climate tolerant, good for hummingbirds, not only nectar, but also that will provide the insects, the lichens, and the perching and the nesting materials for hummingbirds. So there's lots of information that will be coming out, but I'm really glad that people are thinking about what to plant in their backyards.
So one resource is the Garden Club of America has a climate hardiness guide for each zone, and they have been staunch advocates for taking personal action and collective action to address the causes of climate change. But they also have great advice on their site about what plants to plant that will, I think, address your question in Virginia.
Thanks, Ann. And I just want to, since Gary brought it up and David followed, I want to remind everyone that we do have many resources on our website, and a great place to start to know what makes sense for your local backyard would be going to audubon.org. And then up at the very top, you want to hit that little button that says Audubon Near You. And that'll give you a list of all the resources that we have in your community. So that's audubon.org. Audubon Near You is the button you want to hit. It's at the top. And I want to remind everyone on the line that if you have a question, you can just hit 0, and you'll be put into the speaker queue to talk to one of our moderators. So, Gary, you mentioned that you want to see us also, while we're working to do everything that we can to identify the strongholds and strengthen them, that we also have to work toward the root cause of the warming. Well, Dale from Philadelphia has a question about some of that clean energy and what it could mean for birds. Dale, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Okay. I've heard that wind energy producing windmills kill a lot of birds, and a lot of anti-environmental people are using that as an excuse not to change the way we produce energy. Is that as serious a problem as they claim, or is it a myth, or is there anything we could do about it? Thank you.
Gary, why don't you take the bird question, and then we'll turn to David for kind of how we can get over some of that maybe tension in the environmental space.
Sure. It's thank you, Dale. So how renewable energy sources are sited, where on the landscape is very important to minimize as much as possible the impacts to local birds, because one of the challenges birds face is they're kind of looking down when they're flying in, and so it is a fact that in some cases that it's causing mortality of birds like eagles. But to me, it really comes down to smart siting and thinking through how the birds are intersecting with where those wind resources are. And I know that David has a lot to say on this too.
Yeah, so we work with the wind industry and with the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is charged with policing the wind industry. And, not all wind power is created equally. Some technologies are better than others, and we're working really hard, and we from time to time ask you to weigh in with the Fish and Wildlife Service when they're creating regulations to make sure that the kind of wind power that's put in, can, for example, can shut off wind turbines when migrations are sensed, or can take care of food sources on the ground so that birds are less likely to hunt them. There's a lot that can be done to make wind more productive. If we start with the statement and our core belief that climate is the greatest threat to birds and people, then certainly we're going to follow that with support for renewable energy, and we do. And that means that we're going to work really hard to find ways to create renewable energy sources and to deploy them at a very large scale and in a way that does the least amount of harm to birds. So we write about that very frequently on Audubon.org, and I write about it a lot, and we'd love to hear from you on that issue. And I really want to take this opportunity to thank all of you who are Audubon members and do take the time to answer our action alerts. It really matters when legislators or regulators hear from people. They pay attention to where you live and what it is you have to say. So we very much appreciate your response to those.
Thanks very much, both of you, and thanks, Dale, for bringing that up. I just want to remind everyone on the line to press 0 if you have a question. Again, just hit 0 on your phone if you have a question. Speaking of this web of all the things that birds need, we have a question from Kyle. Kyle, go ahead. You should be unmuted there.
Hi, I was seeing if climate change affects us with the seasons and the bats.
Gary, could you tell us the effect that climate change has on seasons and on bats?
Yeah, well, I think the season stuff probably shows itself most for people when they, the sort of the timing and the severity of the first storms, or whether you're having a drought or not. And I think the blooming times of flowers and things we can see in our neighborhoods all the time, like the core part of the seasons are sort of determined by the Earth going around the sun, so that's not going to shift too much. But the severity of how we experience weather and things like that is going to be quite noticeable. And then with bats, I don't have any specific information on bats relative to this study, but it's not hard to imagine, Kyle, that all these big shifts and all the disruption that we're seeing happening for birds is going to happen for bats and all the other plants and animals as well. The troubling thing about climate change is that the fundamentals of rainfall and temperature and how those things change across the year, as you mentioned with the seasons, they're going to affect everything, including us. And so that's why it's so important that we really have to take action together.
Great. Thanks, Kyle, and thanks, Gary. Our next question is from Donnie Lyons in Colorado. Donnie, you should be unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you. I live near Lyons. A year ago, we had that huge flood. They called it a 1,000-year flood. I've lived in my home for 22 years and fed the birds all that time. I live on 10 acres in the foothills. When I was first allowed to come back home, of course, I was anxious to fill the feeders. And for about the first 6 to 8 weeks, I had a total of 5 individual birds. 3 species, 5 individuals. And since then, some birds have come back. Some have come that were never here before. And for most species, the numbers are way down. There was a nice, because we had so much rain this year, there was a nice variety and very colorful and cheerful and fun, but it's just drastically changed. And I'm wondering if there has been a study done on this area or if there's one planned. It covered a huge area of northeastern Colorado because every river coming down out of the mountains flooded. And it
Gary,
went
perhaps you could
way out into the plains and all the way to Nebraska.
perhaps, Gary, you could talk about maybe the flooding and then other extreme events and what we know about their impact on birds.
Yeah. Thanks, Donnie. I mean, it's devastating, isn't it, when you see the birds around your house and your neighborhood get affected that strongly? And
absolutely, and it wasn't just the birds; it's the wildlife too.
Everything, yeah, and how, but it must also have been gratifying to be able to put out food and know that the birds are relying on it. And I think, to me, that also, we're seeing these extreme events are happening at a much greater frequency than they're supposed to, whether it's a flood or a storm surge or a hurricane. It can hardly go a week without seeing some sort of record being broken on the news somewhere in the country. And to me, though, like in terms of what we can do about it and why our actions matter, it speaks to the need to have this whole network of communities and natural places that allow the birds and animals to bounce back when there is an event like this. So we can address the root cause by reducing greenhouse gases to reduce the severity of climate change overall. That's kind of the ultimate thing to do. But in the near term, we can make sure that there's as much habitat and safe places and shelter and food for birds and animals as possible, so that when something, God forbid, does happen like this, they have the best chance to bounce back. And there really is a lot that we can do in our own lives.
Thanks very much, Gary. So, we've heard from, as someone who sounded like a kid, we've heard from people who have lived in the same place for 30 years. How can people who love birds and see them in their backyards, David, how can they talk about this? How can they make sure that other people know that birds are in danger and that something needs to be done?
So go to audubon.org and look at the climate report and tell your friends. Look at the maps. There are maps that show the climate ranges for 314 species of birds, and share those with your friends. Talk to your friends, no matter where they live, about the birds you love and about the threats they face. Our website is a great source for that. Those maps are really engaging, and there's a full list on audubon.org about what you can do, in your backyard, what you can do in your community, what you can do at the state level, and what we can do to preserve habitat so that birds can weather this climate storm. So the very best source for information about that is Audubon's climate site. You'll find lots of tips there. You'll find those maps. Reach out, talk to a friend, ask them to reach out. There are 57 million people in America who say they love birds. That's second only to gardening as a hobby. And I think that if all of our voices were heard at once, if people knew that we wanted to make sure that there were loons in Minnesota and roseate spoonbills in Florida and chestnut-collared longspurs, that that legislators and policymakers would understand that this is a priority. And that's really the point, is that with all of us, with our voices together, can make this a priority.
Thanks, David, very much. So I know that many people have a favorite species, and I want to make sure that everyone knows if you have a favorite species, or you want to look and say, hey, I'm from Missouri, and I want to know what of the 314 birds that are in danger happen to be found in Missouri. You can go to audubon.org/climate and click on the Find a Bird Near You section, and that's a good way to do that. But I also want to make sure that we know that folks are asking about this. So Barb from Lake, and you're going to have to help me with it, Barb, Nebagamon. Would you ask the questions? Because it's one that, thank you, I'm sorry. It's one that we see that lots of folks are asking. So could you go ahead and ask your question, and I think, Gary, you're in a perfect position to answer.
Okay, thank you. I have tons of flowers that I've planted over the years. I don't use pesticides. Everything is organic, but I'm not seeing any songbirds. I've seen 2 hummingbirds all summer, but we have a ton of crows and ravens in our village, and I'm wondering if that has something to do with keeping the songbirds away.
Good question, Barb. I think probably I wouldn't, even though crows can rob nests of eggs and things like that, they probably not the hummingbirds are so fast they could fly circles around the crows and the ravens. And it's interesting locally too. If you just in the neighborhood where I live, I just moved 2 blocks, and they where I was before, I put up a hummingbird feeder and couldn't get any, and then 2 blocks away I put them up, and there's all kinds of hummingbirds. So there can be all these local patterns. So don't give up. Maybe go to your local chapter, Audubon chapter, and ask what people living near you are having success with. Maybe you need to try changing your bird seed or other things. But don't stop trying. It's really important.
Thanks very much, Barb. So I see that a couple of folks have questions about, again, more precisely about what Audubon is doing. So Emily from Colorado, if you want to ask your question of David, I think that now would be a great time. You should be unmuted.
Okay. Hi.
Go for it.
I was wondering what other organizations the Audubon Society might be collaborating with, because I know you guys do a lot of great research and collect a lot of information, so I was wondering if you're using that towards management plans or anything like that.
That's kind of a 2-tiered question. So maybe, David, if you could take the partnerships, and then maybe, Gary, if you could give folks a sense of all the folks that we're going to give this to on the ground, I think that'd be great. So, David, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So, Emily, thanks so much for that question. We partner with most of the other major conservation organizations on any number of projects. So, on bringing BP's penalty money to the Gulf Coast, for example, we partnered with the National Wildlife Federation and with Environmental Defense Fund. So we partner with organizations all over the country, and we partner with governmental agencies, and that's going to be an increasingly important part of this, especially state fish and wildlife agencies, and I'll let Gary talk about that. But we meet regularly with and collaborate with virtually every conservation organization that you know, on a regional basis and on a national basis. If you think there's an opportunity out there for us to partner with one of those organizations on a specific issue, feel free to please send me an email and let me know. These problems are so big, there's no way that we can solve them by ourselves. We value partnerships.
Thanks, David. And Gary, what about some of the wildlife services and the land managers?
Yeah, I first just wanted to add that one of the things that I've always loved about Audubon is just that there's a national program, but there's also 23 state programs that have very local state-based projects with their own collaborators. And don't forget, there's 467 chapters, so we're in virtually every part of the country with people from everywhere who just care about birds in their communities. And so at each of those different aspects of Audubon, there are meaningful partnerships that are going on all the time. So there's no way we could even list them all. In terms of how we're working with federal and state agencies and the climate report, we are right now going around briefing folks from the Fish and Wildlife Service Refuges, from the Bureau of Land Management, from the USDA, and I recently just spoke to many of the state Department of Natural Resources groups at their annual meeting in St. Louis, and so we are doing what we can to spread the word and share the data that we have, so that the information about birds can be brought into decision making that will inform all the work done by state and federal agencies. And then that plus all the local work with local groups at the various levels I mentioned, all add up to a really big impact.
Thanks, both of you.
I would just add, Lindsay, that we started this work in partnership with the National Fish and Wildlife Service, with 12 of their regional agencies. And the multiplier effect that we're going to have by sharing the data with Fish and Wildlife Service agencies across the country and nationally is that they're going to then be able to build this climate tool, this bird-based climate tool, into their other planning methods. And what we've heard is that they're really excited about this They've never seen anything quite like it, and they're eager to adopt it. We had a meeting in D.C. just yesterday with senior administration officials, and they were just really over the moon about it.
Thanks so much, guys. So Jesse from Stone Mountain, Georgia, has a question about the severity and what we'll really do if we're talking about some extinctions. Jesse, go ahead. You should be unmuted.
Hi. Is it true that we're going to lose 50% of our birds in 20 years? And if we do, should we use the DNA and bring them back? I mean, I love having the birds in my yard. I have all types of birds here. Hummingbirds, robins, finches, I can't think of the name of it. It's beautiful bird. I have all kinds of wildlife in my backyard, and I love it, and I don't want to lose it. Should we do anything we can to make sure they don't go away?
Yeah, thank you, Jesse, for that. And like so many of us, your passion is clear for your love of the birds in your community, in your backyard, which we all share. And so the report itself suggests that 314 birds are going to lose more than 50% of their current climate space. But isn't the same thing as them going extinct. So that's the good news. The bad news is dealing with 314 birds being threatened in addition to all the traditional conservation threats is still a tall order. I personally believe that there is so much that we can do individually and collectively to protect the birds and make sure that extinction never happens. And I'm never going to write off any bird. I think long before we get to the idea of using DNA to bring them back, or sometimes they call it de-extinction, some of the technology is starting to catch up where that's possible. It would be much simpler just to make sure that we don't get to that point, and I think we really can.
Yeah, that's a really exotic solution, and the problem with looking at an exotic solution like that is it overlooks the really practical ones that are available to us right now, which is to look at the places that birds are going to need over the next 80 years to weather this storm. And as Gary often reminds all of us, nature's incredibly resilient, and while birds are adapted to the places that they know, they're also flexible, and you just don't know where birds are going to be able to survive as conditions change. So the whole idea here is to buy time while this climate storm passes over us.
Excellent. Thanks to you both. We have now Vic from California who wants to talk about another possible solution.
Yeah,
Vic, go ahead. You should be unmuted.
Thank you very much. Vic Leipzig from Huntington Beach, California. Thanks to National for leading the way on this important issue. One of the things that National has recently done is distributed some postcards that we can send to the federal EPA asking them to stand strong in their regulation of carbon dioxide emissions. I'd like National folks to tell us a little more about what the federal EPA is doing there. And then finally, for those that we can't distribute these cards to, is there another way that they can give their input to the EPA, say by email?
Thanks very much, Vic. David, you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah. So thanks for mentioning those postcards. It is really important to comment. Those rules are controversial, and we think they're essential. Right now, there's no way to get legislation through Congress that will take carbon out of the atmosphere, and the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions is power plants, and the EPA has the authority to do that. So please do comment. And the EPA also has comment lines on its website. You can also do that. And we will periodically send out action alerts. So I think that there's a lot that can be done at the local level. There's a lot that can be done at the state and regional level. And right now, our very best shot is supporting the EPA on that rule. I don't know how many of you are subscribers to Audubon magazine, but if you take a look at the current issue and the previous issue, you'll see that there are T-shirts available that say "Save Our Songs," and they're available with iconic birds from each of the 4 flyways. And it's our hope that millions of people will buy those shirts and then show up at town hall meetings with state legislators, with local legislators, with national representatives, and sit in the front row with those T-shirts and let them know that you see climate change through birds, that you're passionate about birds, and that you want them to take action. Because at the end of the day, and this is really important, I think if I could say just one thing to you tonight, it would be this. This isn't an issue for red states, and it's not an issue for blue states. This is a bird issue. It transcends politics.
Thanks so much, and thanks, Vic, for bringing that up. I want to make sure that we have time to take some more questions. So I want to remind everyone that to get yourself into the queue to ask a question, you just need to hit 1. I'd now like to ask David from Springfield, Illinois. David, what's your question? And I'd like to hear, David Jarnold answer it. So go ahead, David.
Hi, yes. I'm involved in restoration and species recovery for birds of prey in my state. And my question is, restoration of habitat and recovery programs have been gaining momentum, but a change in public attitudes towards the importance of birds seems to be lagging behind conservation efforts. What are some of the ways we can address this issue besides just showing people statistics?
So I want to make sure I understand, David. It sounds like you're asking about how do we change public attitudes, right?
Addressing the public attitudes, one thing I've noticed through speaking with a lot of people is they like the birds, but a lot of them have questions and don't really understand the importance of birds in ecosystems and how they interact with them. And a lot of times it's not easy to communicate to the public just using statistics and the science. I was just wondering if there are any resources or any particular ways that have been proven to be fairly effective in demonstrating the importance of birds to people without just bombarding them with information.
David, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, and I'm going to ask Gary to weigh in as well. I know what you mean when you say that you can't bombard people with a lot of statistics and expect them to get it. So I think that finding a really simple, straightforward story about the fact that birds are very often a key component in making sure that ecosystems are healthy, that everything from being pollinators to living insect eradicators to making sure that systems are in balance and that rodents are controlled, that birds help keep everything in equilibrium. I mean, maybe a very simple approach, something along those lines, that birds really help keep nature in an equilibrium, and birds have always been a great indicator of the health of ecosystems. I wouldn't try really complicated arguments for the most part. I would probably stay with something fairly straightforward like that. Gary, when you talk to people about the importance of birds, what resonates with them?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways it's actually not a science explanation, but just a community values one that even if people don't know much about ecosystems or how they work or any of the complexities, they naturally understand that birds are a part of where they live, that people everywhere like to hear birds and consider them part of the changing seasons and just part of the fabric of their community. And so when you start talking to them about things like climate change through the lens of that fabric of community shifting, it really resonates with them. And if you can couple that with an iconic species that really defines a place like common loon, if you're a Minnesotan and thinking about not being able to hear the tremolo of the loon in the summer with your grandkids, if you can combine those two things, you can really kind of cut through the intellectual parts of this and get right to the core values that everyone responds to.
Thanks, both of you, and I hope you think that that's helpful when you guys are out in the ground and trying to explain to other people why they should love birds too. So I want to remind everyone, if you have a question, please just hit 0 and you'll be put into a queue. Right now we have a question from Michael from Newcastle, New Hampshire. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, I know that I spoke earlier to somebody and I thought I was online. Thank you for this forum. I find it intriguing and fascinating. I asked about 3 questions, but I want to ask 4, and let me just throw this out to you guys. I live in New Hampshire, and we're heading into the cold season, and there are crows in our neighborhood, and I do see the birds, and I find that the crows it's almost like they are calling me, talking to me, or is that true, or do you think it's my imagination? First question.
I'll take a crack at that. So the crows are and ravens are incredibly smart, and they often have these colonial roosts where they share information about where food sources are and things like that. And so sometimes people feel like the crows are increasing dramatically, and really they're just moved their roost around. But they're also really smart about sharing information. If they think that someone's a threat to them, I wouldn't be surprised if they were making quite a lot of racket too.
Great, thank you. So let's get back to someone else who is doing a different kind of solution. So go ahead, hang on one moment. Dale from Highlands, New Jersey. Dale, I think that you just participated in something and you wanted to know what's next. So go ahead, Dale.
Yes, I had a question about, recently we had a nice climate march in New York City, 400,000 of us, in which happily Audubon took a part. And I think we need to continue to grab the attention of lawmakers, and I was wondering if Audubon had anything else planned for the future on a large scale like this?
Thanks, Dale. David, could you take that one?
Sure. So that march was really inspiring. There were about 150 of us from the tri-state area, and it was really terrific. We had the good fortune, I spent the next morning with the 2 primary organizers of that march who hadn't seen each other since the march, and it was a really teary and sweet moment after that huge success. So yeah, what Audubon has planned is not necessarily mass action like that, but what we want to do is to ask all 463 of those chapters, all 22 of the state offices that Gary talked about, all 41 of our educational centers are going to ask people to step up to preserve habitat and to be in touch with their legislators as opportunities arise in communities. So there are different opportunities in different places. Where you are in New Jersey, there may be some land use issue around wetlands. There certainly are issues around coastal birds. So there's an opportunity there to protect coastlines. In Michigan, there's an opportunity to pass a renewable energy standard. In California, there are opportunities there to increase their renewable energy standards. So there are in every community there will be some opportunity to step up for birds, and we think that the action is not necessarily going to be another climate march, but it's going to be Audubon members every day for years to come speaking on behalf of birds and talking about the threat of climate change. One of the things that legislators know is that people have a hard time getting their arms around the threat of climate change. It's about glaciers and polar bears, and increasingly And that's a very hard thing for people to turn out at community meetings to talk about. But it's not hard for any of you to talk about the birds of prey that you love, or the birds that aren't showing up in your backyards anymore in Virginia, or the plants that are moving in, hardiness zones. You can educate local legislators and state legislators. You can influence land use decisions as well as taking action in your own backyard. So while we would certainly love to see more large mobilizations, really Audubon has the opportunity, because we're a grassroots organization that's unified around our passion for birds, we have an opportunity to move the needle on climate and habitat in communities across America. Nobody's tried to do it before. The launch of this report on the 8th of September was the beginning of a years-long initiative. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks very much, David. So one of the things you mentioned was land managers. So I'd like to take a question from Philip from Texas. Philip, go ahead.
Hi. The question I have is there any plans on maybe trying to link conservation easements with climate change to maybe give incentive to people to either deed their land over or change it to where it's a deed restricted, where it can't be improved? And I say that because in Texas, we're one of the largest, fastest growing population. And where I live, the old joke is, if there's an open space, a house is going there.
Gary, you mentioned our science being a kind of roadmap. Could you give us and Philip a sense of how our science might help us inform those discussions, and so we could get to a point where we could know some of the strongholds with the private landowners, particularly ranchers?
Sure, yeah, and then maybe I'll see whether David has any comments on programs like Philip is mentioning. But if we were going to design such a program, one of the nice things about the Audubon Climate Report is that we now know the places where the birds are now, and where no matter what happens with the climate, they're going to be in the future if we take care of the underlying habitat and do proper stewardship of the land. And so it's exactly that kind of roadmap that can help us create smart programs like the one you're mentioning that can do the right thing for birds and for people, even in the face of climate change. David, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so land conservancies happen at the local level. They happen at the large nonprofit level. They happen at the state level. So my first suggestion would be to make sure that your local land conservancy knows about our report and is using it when they talk to landowners. It's new, so it's probably not happening yet, but they can and they should. In addition to that, I'm in conversations with the CEOs of the Trust for Public Land and the Nature Conservancy, and they're also very interested in building our science into their planning for conservation easements. I have no doubt that over the next few years, increasingly, state agencies and smaller land conservancies will begin to use this tool. The best way to make that happen, the quickest way to make that happen, is for you to ask for it to happen, to talk to local land conservancies and ask them to use our model.
Great. Thank you very much. So before we take our last question live, I just want to remind everyone that if you're in the queue and we didn't get to you, I'm very sorry, but once you hang up, you'll receive a call back where you'll have a chance to ask a question on a message. And then I want to make sure that everyone knows, we've said it a couple of times, but I just want to make sure, audubon.org/climate. That's where you can see all 314 species. You can search for the species that you love. You can search based on where you live. You can get more information on the science as well as what you can do. So before we wrap up, I want to give Mary Beth a chance. I believe she's from Hudson, Wisconsin. Mary Beth, go ahead. You should be on mute.
Okay. I am the director of the Interfaith Ocean Ethics Campaign, and the reason I'm also a bird lover, but we've begun some discussions with the Audubon chapter in Delaware and the one in Minnesota about outreach to faith communities. You've been talking about partnership building and talking about reaching new audiences, and 85% of Americans self-identify as religious. Yet many conservation organizations don't really do outreach to communities of faith very effectively. And we have gathered a coalition of partners that are based around the principles of care of creation, responsibility to the poor, and to brother and sister species, to raise our young in ways of good living, and the future generations. All of those principles, come to bear when we're looking at climate change and the poverty. We're looking at the effect on birds. We're looking everything. And one of the innovative ways we're trying to reach out is to think about, as you said, in Minnesota, we love our loons. And many, many, people of faith in their congregation feed the birds, and they love the birds, and they care about the loons. And yet they may not know the connection to the oceans and the oceans to climate and those kinds of things. And the oceans, because people love to be at the beach, there is an attraction there. So what we are trying to do, and would like to do with the national level too, is build a partnership where we would build a faith curriculum with the science of both climate change and the oceans, but also the connection to the favorite bird species in the area. And we feel that might be a way, a fresh way for it to be personal, and to start seeing connections, and to see the connections between poverty. And so I guess what I would query is, have you been looking into that on the national level, and what outreach have you done to the care of creation organizations, Interfaith Power and Light, those kinds of things?
Yeah, so I love that question. Sally Bingham, who, as you know, is one of the founders of Interfaith Power and Light, is a good friend of mine, and we've talked with them. The head of our Minnesota state office was the executive director of the National Religious Partnership for the Environment. I think that the faith community is a powerful and still kind of latent force on climate. I think that notion, the whole idea around creation care, is just so powerful, and it bridges so many divides, that finding a way to have that message come from communities all over America, regardless of faith, is just so important. And that's another way where Audubon is uniquely positioned. Being a grassroots organization, we sit in pews alongside people who can influence local land use decisions. We go to synagogue with them. We come from those places. We don't parachute in from New York or San Francisco. So, again, I think the interfaith movement is something that really has to be driven at the local level, but I'm definitely interested in having core national curriculum. So if you want to send me some thoughts about what core national curriculum might look like, send it to Office of the President at audubon.org. I would love to look at it, and I would love to build a deep, rich partnership based on creation care.
Great. Thanks so much, David, and thanks, Mary Beth, for that question. So we've talked about a lot. We've talked about how you can get started in your backyard. We've talked about the resources that you can find with Audubon assets all over the United States. Hopefully you'll all go to audubon.org/climate to learn more about the study and what you can do wherever you live, and regardless of how you're ready to help us make this a better and safer place for the 314 birds. Before we close out, Gary, is there one additional thought or one thing you'd like to leave listeners with, and then we'll turn to David to close us out?
Sure, absolutely. So the Audubon Climate Change Report is in, and the news is grim. It's not great news, but and it sometimes can feel overwhelming, I think, especially when we think about ourselves in our individual lives. What can we do about this overwhelming problem? But I am very confident that we can do so much to make the world a better place for birds and for people, and we can tap in to our passion for those things And it's not too late to start talking to our friends and neighbors and come together to do the right thing for birds and people, and leave the world a better place for our children and grandchildren as well. So the most important thing is to start taking action.
Yeah, so I would.
And David, what would you like us to remember?
I would like to first thank everybody who acts on behalf of Audubon. There's a lot of ways to choose to spend your time, and when you choose to spend it on our behalf, we're honored by that. Tell a friend about a bird that you love and the threat that it faces. That is the most important thing you can do. And when we send you one of the many, many mailings or emailings that asks for your support, remember that there are hundreds of people who come to work at Audubon every day to help make the world a better place for birds and for kids. And please do support us. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your time and for your attention and your love for birds. We'll do everything we can to have this recording live on our website by next week. And thank you very much for your time, and have a fabulous rest of the week. Good night, everyone.